March 18th, 1967. The Beverly Hills Hotel's Crystal Ballroom. The Academy Awards after-party was in full swing when Victoria Torrino, wife of notorious mob boss Anthony the Blade Torrino, decided to make what she thought would be a power move against America's sweetheart. Well. Victoria announced loudly enough for the entire VIP section to hear, "If it isn't Hollywood's little princess, tell me, Doris, do you actually believe you're as pure and innocent as your movies pretend?" What happened next would become the most talked about exchange in Hollywood party history, as 5 perfectly chosen words from Doris Day would not only end Victoria Torrino's reign as unofficial queen of Hollywood's underground social scene, but would also trigger the complete collapse of the Torrino crime family's West Coast operations. Victoria Torrino had been trying to establish herself as a major player in Hollywood's elite social circles for 3 years. As the wife of one of Chicago's most feared mob bosses, she had money, intimidation tactics, and the kind of dangerous connections that made some people afraid to cross her. Victoria thought her husband's reputation would buy her respect in Hollywood, recalled former party planner Maxine Chen. She didn't understand that fear and respect are completely different things. Victoria had been using a combination of lavish parties, expensive gifts, and subtle threats to force her way into exclusive Hollywood events. Some stars, producers, and executives had reluctantly accepted her presence rather than risk her husband's displeasure. She would show up at premieres and industry events, acting like she belonged there, explained former studio executive Martin Davis. People tolerated her because they were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. But Doris Day had never been intimidated by Victoria's attempts to buy her way into Hollywood society. Unlike some stars who feared mob retaliation, Doris had consistently refused Victoria's invitations, avoided her at events, and made it clear that she had no interest in associating with organized crime figures or their families. Miss Day had principles that couldn't be bought or threatened, recalled her former publicist Ruth Birch. She wanted nothing to do with people who represented violence and corruption. Victoria's resentment toward Doris had been building for months. Every time Doris publicly ignored her or declined her invitations, Victoria felt her carefully constructed image of power and acceptance being undermined. Victoria saw Doris as the one person in Hollywood who refused to acknowledge her importance, observed former gossip columnist Luella Parsons. That drove her absolutely crazy. The March 18th after-party had been the perfect opportunity for Victoria to make a public power play. With hundreds of Hollywood's most important figures present, she decided to humiliate Doris Day in front of the people whose approval she desperately craved. Victoria's attack was calculated and cruel. "Looking at you, Doris, I just can't understand how someone so boring and ordinary became such a big star. Maybe it's because Americans prefer their entertainment as bland and flavorless as their personalities." The VIP section fell silent as Victoria continued her public assault. "I mean, honestly, what's your secret? Is it the squeaky clean image, the fake smile, or do you just remind people of the uninteresting lives they're trying to escape from?" Victoria paused, clearly expecting Doris to be embarrassed, defensive, or intimidated by this public humiliation in front of Hollywood's elite. Instead, Doris Day looked directly at Victoria Torrino with the calm authority that had made her legendary and spoke 5 words that would haunt Victoria for the rest of her life. "I have your husband's tapes." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Victoria's face went completely white as the meaning of those 5 words hit her. Everyone in the VIP section understood immediately that Doris wasn't making an empty threat, she was stating a fact that could destroy everything Victoria held dear. The change in Victoria was incredible to witness, recalled actress Elizabeth Taylor, who was standing nearby. She went from arrogant and aggressive to terrified and speechless in a matter of seconds. What made Doris's response so perfectly destructive wasn't just the implication that she had evidence of Anthony Torrino's crimes, but the calm certainty with which she delivered it. Miss Day didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, didn't make any dramatic gestures, remembered producer Ross Hunter. She just stated a simple fact that made it clear Victoria had made a fatal mistake. The tapes Doris was referring to were recordings that had come into her possession through her late husband's business connections. Martin Melcher, before his death, had unknowingly acquired evidence of Anthony Torrino's criminal activities through a real estate deal gone wrong. When Doris discovered the recordings among Martin's papers, she had quietly turned them over to federal authorities, keeping copies as insurance against exactly the kind of situation Victoria had just created. Victoria realized in that moment that her husband's freedom, their family's fortune, and her own safety now depended on the discretion of the woman she had just tried to publicly humiliate, noted former FBI agent Robert Chen, who had been working the Torrino case. The aftermath of those 5 words was swift and complete. Within hours, word of the exchange had spread throughout Hollywood. Industry insiders understood that Victoria Torrino no longer had any power or protection in their world. Once people knew that Doris Day had evidence that could destroy the Torrino family, nobody wanted anything to do with Victoria, explained former agent Irving Lazar. But the consequences extended far beyond Hollywood social circles. Anthony Torrino, when he learned what had happened, realized that his wife's attempt to establish their legitimacy had instead exposed their vulnerability to someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. Tony understood immediately that his wife had picked a fight with the one person in Hollywood who could destroy them completely, recalled former Chicago crime reporter Art Patak. Within weeks, the Torrino family began pulling back from their West Coast operations, understanding that their position had been fatally compromised. Victoria's dreams of Hollywood acceptance were over, but more importantly, she had triggered a chain of events that would lead to her husband's eventual downfall. The federal investigation that followed, armed with the evidence Doris had provided, would ultimately result in Anthony Torrino's conviction and the dismantling of his criminal organization. Victoria's attack on Doris Day ended up being the mistake that brought down the entire Torrino operation, observed organized crime historian Thomas Repetto. But perhaps most remarkably, Doris never used her devastating knowledge for personal gain or revenge. She had simply used it once, precisely when necessary, to end an attack and protect herself with surgical effectiveness. Miss Day never talked about the tapes publicly, never threatened anyone else with them, never used them for anything except stopping Victoria Torrino's attempt to humiliate her, recalled former assistant Charlie Cullen Walters. The story of those 5 words became legendary in both Hollywood and law enforcement circles as an example of how real power works when it's wielded by someone with genuine strength and principles. Doris Day showed that sometimes the most devastating response to aggression isn't aggression in return, but simply revealing that you have the power to destroy your attacker completely if you choose to, noted former prosecutor Thomas Foran. Victoria Torrino never appeared at another Hollywood event. She and her husband moved back to Chicago, where their influence and reputation had been permanently damaged by their failed attempt to conquer Hollywood society. Victoria learned too late that intimidation only works against people who can be intimidated, observed former party hostess Merle Oberon. Doris Day was not one of those people. The mob family that had thought it could buy its way into Hollywood legitimacy had instead discovered that some people cannot be bought, threatened, or impressed by money and violence. The Torrino family represented everything that Hollywood pretended to be sophisticated about but actually feared, explained film historian David Thompson. Doris Day represented everything that Hollywood actually respected but rarely admitted: genuine class, authentic principles, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through intimidation. March 18, 1967. A mob wife thought she could publicly humiliate America's sweetheart and gain status by destroying someone who represented everything she couldn't buy. Instead, 5 words from Doris Day revealed who really had power, who really had class, and who really understood that true strength comes from being prepared for battle while hoping never to fight one. Victoria Torrino learned that some people become powerful by taking things from others, while others become powerful by being ready to protect themselves and others when protection is needed. Doris Day proved that night that the most devastating weapons aren't threats or violence, but truth wielded by someone with the courage to use it precisely when it's needed most. I have your husband's tapes. 5 words that ended a mob family's Hollywood ambitions and reminded everyone present that real power belongs to people who don't need to prove they have it until someone forces them to prove it. Some battles are won with violence. Others are won with 5 words that reveal exactly who is really in control and who just thought they were. Victoria Torrino thought she was in control until she met someone who actually was in control, and who was willing to prove it with the kind of calm authority that comes from being prepared for exactly the situation Victoria had created. The mob wife who thought she could intimidate America's sweetheart learned that some people can't be intimidated because they're already holding all the cards. They just don't show their hand until someone forces them to. Doris Day showed her hand once, for 5 words, and it was enough to end a criminal empire's Hollywood dreams forever. That's what real power looks like when it's challenged by fake power. The real power wins with 5 words, while the fake power loses everything by underestimating who they're dealing with. Victoria Torrino underestimated Doris Day once. It was enough to destroy everything she thought she had built, and everything she thought she could take from someone who was stronger, smarter, and more prepared than she had ever imagined possible. 5 words, 1 battle. Complete victory for the side that understood what they were fighting for, and complete defeat for the side that thought intimidation was the same thing as strength. It never is, especially when you're trying to intimidate someone who has more real strength than you have fake strength, and who's willing to use it exactly once, precisely when necessary, with devastating effectiveness. Like Doris Day did on March 18, 1967, when 5 words ended a mob family's Hollywood ambitions forever.